Grace had always been meticulous with her finances. Every month she carefully reviewed her credit card statements, ensuring that no expense went unnoticed. It was a routine that gave her a sense of control in her otherwise chaotic life as a marketing executive. But this time, as she skimmed through the digital statement on her phone during her lunch break, her heart skipped a beat. A charge for $21,000 stood out like a glaring red flag. Her initial reaction was disbelief. "This has to be a mistake," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling slightly. She refreshed the page, hoping the figure would disappear, but it remained there, as unyielding as her mounting anxiety. The transaction description listed a luxury travel agency, one she had never heard of, let alone used. Panic set in as her mind raced through scenarios. Had her card been stolen? Was she a victim of fraud? How could something like this have slipped past her? She immediately dialed her bank's customer service number. After a long wait filled with maddeningly repetitive hold music, a polite representative finally answered. "Thank you for calling. How can I assist you today?" "There's a $21,000 charge on my credit card that I didn't authorize," Grace explained, her voice tight with urgency. "It's from some travel agency." The representative asked her for the usual security details before pulling up her account. "I see the charge here," he said after a brief pause. "It was made 2 days ago and appears to have been processed directly by the agency." Grace's stomach dropped. "So it wasn't flagged as suspicious?" "No, ma'am. It went through our standard checks and nothing unusual was detected." "Have you tried contacting the merchant directly?" Feeling a wave of helplessness wash over her, Grace asked for the agency's contact details. Hanging up, she stared at her phone, debating her next move. She felt violated, as though someone had broken into her personal space. Little did she know that the perpetrator was closer than she could have ever imagined. She called the travel agency, her heart pounding in her chest. A cheerful receptionist answered, and Grace explained the situation. "There's been a mistake. I didn't make this booking. Can you cancel it?" The receptionist hesitated. "Let me pull up the reservation," she said, typing away on her keyboard. "Yes, I see the booking. It's for a trip to the Maldives, staying at a 5-star resort, full package. Unfortunately, the booking is non-refundable." Grace clenched her fists. "Non-refundable? I didn't authorize this. Someone used my card fraudulently." "I understand, ma'am," the receptionist replied sympathetically. "But the reservation was made under your name, with your email and phone number provided as contact information." That statement threw Grace off. Her mind reeled as she tried to make sense of it. Who could have known her details? The receptionist continued. "The travelers listed are Andrew Brown and Mr. and Ms. Brown. Does that sound familiar?" Her world stopped. Andrew was her younger brother, and Mr. and Miss Brown were, of course, her parents. The realization hit her like a freight train, leaving her stunned and speechless. It wasn't a fraudster, it was her own family. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the receptionist asked after a moment of silence. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, I'm here. Thank you for the information. I'll call you back if needed." She ended the call abruptly, her hands shaking as she set her phone down. Her emotions swung between anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Why would her parents do this? How could they? She took a few deep breaths, trying to calm herself. Her lunch sat untouched, her appetite completely gone. As the initial shock wore off, anger bubbled to the surface. She decided to confront her parents immediately. There was no way she could focus on work with this unresolved. Driving to her parents' house felt like an eternity. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, rehearsing what she would say. By the time she parked in their driveway, her heart was racing. She marched up to the front door, her jaw set, and rang the bell with more force than necessary. Her mother, Taylor, opened the door, her face lighting up in surprise. "Grace! What a pleasant surprise! Come in, come in." But Grace wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. She stepped inside, her expression hard. "Where's Dad?" she asked curtly. Taylor frowned, sensing something was wrong. "He's in the living room. Is everything okay?" Grace didn't answer, heading straight to where her father, Robert, was seated, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled. Grace, what brings you here? She didn't waste time. Did you use my credit card to book a $21,000 vacation? The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Her parents exchanged a quick glance, their expressions shifting from confusion to guilt. Taylor wrung her hands nervously. Grace, listen. Don't grace me, she snapped, her voice rising. Answer the question. Did you or did you not use my card? Robert sighed heavily, setting the newspaper aside. Yes, we did. But it's not what you think. Grace let out a bitter laugh. Not what I think? You charged $21,000 to my credit card without asking me. What else could it possibly be? Taylor stepped forward, her tone defensive. Andrew has been under so much stress lately with his studies. He needed a break. And we thought since you've been doing so well financially, you wouldn't mind helping out. Grace stared at her mother, incredulous. Helping out? This isn't helping out. This is stealing. How could you do this to me? Her mother's face hardened. Stealing? After everything we've done for you, the years we spent raising you, supporting you, and this is how you repay us? By calling us thieves? Robert tried to intervene. Let's all calm down. We were going to pay you back. When? Grace shot back. You can barely cover your own bills. Where were you planning to get $21,000? Neither of them had an answer. Grace shook her head, her disappointment cutting deeper than her anger. I can't believe this. You've completely crossed a line. I'm calling the agency to cancel the trip. Taylor's voice rose in panic. No, you can't. The booking is non-refundable. We'll lose everything. Grace's laugh was hollow. Good. Maybe you'll learn a lesson. As she stormed out of the house, tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She had never felt so betrayed. The people she had trusted most had taken advantage of her in the worst way possible, and she wasn't sure their relationship could ever recover. Grace drove home in silence, her thoughts spinning like a tornado. Anger coursed through her veins, but beneath it all, a deep sense of betrayal clawed at her heart. She had always been a responsible daughter, the one her parents could count on. But this? Using her credit card without her consent to pay for a lavish vacation for her younger brother? It felt like a slap in the face. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her small townhouse, she sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her mind replayed the confrontation with her parents, their excuses, their attempts to shift the blame. Andrew's name kept coming up, and with each mention, her resentment grew. It was always about Andrew, the golden child who could do no wrong. He was the baby of the family, the one who got all the attention, while Grace had been expected to grow up quickly and take care of herself. She sighed, her breath shaky. Why does it always have to be me? She whispered to no one in particular. Forcing herself to move, she grabbed her bag and headed inside. The first thing Grace did was open her laptop. She needed answers, legal, financial, and emotional. Typing furiously, she searched for stories of others who had experienced similar betrayals. To her surprise, there were countless threads on forums and social media platforms where people shared stories of family members exploiting their finances. It was oddly comforting to know she wasn't alone. But it also made her angrier. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated choice her parents had made. Her search led her to a few key questions. Was this legally considered theft? Could she pursue legal action against her own parents? And if she did, what would that mean for their relationship? She opened another tab and began searching for lawyers who specialized in financial disputes. Even if she didn't want to press charges, she needed to understand her rights. After about an hour of research, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. Taylor, Grace, we need to talk. Please don't do anything drastic. We're still your family, Grace scoffed, her frustration boiling over. She slammed her laptop shut and decided to respond later. Right now, she needed a break from them. Instead, she called her best friend, Megan, who had always been her sounding board. Megan answered on the second ring. Hey, Grace, what's up? Grace hesitated for a moment, unsure where to begin. Do you have a few minutes? I need to vent. Of course, Megan said, her tone immediately serious. What's going on? Grace explained everything. The unexpected charge, the confrontation with her parents, and their audacious justification. By the time she finished, Megan was practically fuming on her behalf. "Are you kidding me?" Megan exclaimed. "They used your card without asking? That's not just disrespectful, it's illegal." "I know," Grace said, her voice heavy with frustration. "But what am I supposed to do? Sue my own parents?" Megan paused. "Look, I get that it's complicated because they're your family. But they can't just walk all over you like this. If you let it slide, what's stopping them from doing it again?" Grace sighed. That's what I'm afraid of. But if I push too hard, I might lose them completely." "Grace, I love you, but this isn't your fault. They crossed the line, not you. You have every right to stand up for yourself." Megan's words lingered in Grace's mind long after the call ended. She knew her friend was right, but it didn't make the situation any easier. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about Andrew. He had to know what their parents had done. Did he even care? The next day, Grace decided to confront him. She sent Andrew a text, asking if he could meet for coffee. His response came quickly. "Andrew sure says, everything okay?" Grace rolled her eyes. Did he really not know, or was he playing dumb? She replied with the time and place, then spent the rest of the day mentally preparing herself. When she arrived at the cafe, Andrew was already there, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Hey, Grace, it's been a while." She forced a smile and sat down. "Yeah, it has." "How's school?" "Busy, but good," he said, setting his phone aside. "What about you? How's work?" "It's fine," she said curtly, cutting to the chase. "Andrew, did you know Mom and Dad used my credit card to pay for your vacation?" "Ugh!" His smile faltered. "What? No, are you serious?" "Yes, I'm serious," Grace said, her tone sharp. "They charged $21,000 to my card without telling me. That trip you're going on? I'm the one paying for it." Andrew looked genuinely surprised. "I'd no idea. They never said anything about that." Grace studied his face, trying to gauge whether he was being honest. "So you didn't think it was weird when they offered to take you to the Maldives? Did you even ask how they could afford it?" He hesitated, guilt creeping into his expression. "I mean, I guess I didn't think about it. They just said they wanted to do something nice for me." "Something nice?" Grace said, her voice rising. "Do you realize how irresponsible that is? They're putting me in debt so you can have a vacation." Andrew looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Grace, I didn't know. I'll talk to them." Grace shook her head, her frustration mounting. "Talking isn't enough. They need to pay me back, Andrew. This isn't fair." "I get it," he said, his tone defensive. "But what do you want me to do? It's not like I have $21,000 lying around." "I don't want your money," she snapped. "I want you to understand how messed up this is. You're their favorite, Andrew. You always have been. And now I'm paying for it. Literally." Andrew's face turned red. "That's not fair, Grace. I didn't ask to be treated differently." "Maybe not," she said, standing up. "But you benefit from it whether you realize it or not." She grabbed her bag and left the cafe, her emotions a tangled mess. Confronting Andrew hadn't brought her the closure she'd hoped for. If anything, it only deepened her sense of isolation. As she drove home, one thought kept replaying in her mind. How had her family come to this? The morning after her confrontation with Andrew, Grace woke up feeling emotionally drained. Her mind replayed every word they had exchanged, every flicker of guilt she had seen on his face, and the way he had deflected responsibility. It left a sour taste in her mouth. For years, she had silently endured the favoritism her parents showed toward Andrew, excusing it as normal family dynamics. But this time was different. This wasn't just about who got more attention or praise. This was about her livelihood, her hard-earned money, and her trust being blatantly disregarded. Sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, Grace opened her laptop and stared at her budget spreadsheet. The $21,000 charge loomed over her finances like a dark cloud. While she had some savings and a decent income, This sudden, unauthorized debt threatened to destabilize everything she had worked so hard to build. Rent, utilities, groceries, her car payment. It all felt heavier now, knowing she'd have to juggle paying off a massive balance on top of her usual expenses. She considered her options. Canceling the vacation seemed impossible thanks to the agency's strict no-refund policy. Pressing charges against her parents felt extreme, but letting them off the hook entirely wasn't an option either. The nagging thought that she might never see that money again filled her with dread. Determined to regain some control, Grace spent the next few hours researching her rights. She learned that technically what her parents had done could be classified as unauthorized use of a credit card, which was illegal, even if the offenders were family. She also found advice from others who had dealt with similar situations, many of whom stressed the importance of setting boundaries, even if it meant alienating loved ones. Her next step was to consult a financial advisor. She scheduled an appointment for later that week, hoping they could guide her through the mess. In the meantime, she decided to confront her parents again, this time with a clear demand: repayment within 2 months, or she'd escalate the matter legally. The idea of threatening legal action against her own parents made her stomach churn, but she couldn't let them think their behavior was acceptable. Later that evening, she drove back to her parents' house. The tension in the air was palpable as she walked in. Taylor and Robert were seated on the couch, their expressions wary. They had clearly been expecting her. "Grace," Taylor began, her tone carefully measured, "we know you're upset, but—" "Upset doesn't even begin to cover it," Grace interrupted, her voice firm. She sat down across from them, folding her arms. "We need to talk about how you're going to pay me back." Her father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "We told you, Grace, we'll figure it out. But these things take time." "You don't have time," Grace said sharply. "You have 2 months. If I don't have the full $21,000 by then, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." Taylor gasped. "Legal action against your own family? Grace, how could you even think of doing something like that?" "Because you didn't think twice about stealing from me," Grace shot back. "Do you realize what this has done to my finances, my credit score, my trust in you?" "We didn't steal," Taylor protested, her voice rising. "We borrowed. And we did it for Andrew. He needed this. And I didn't need to be burdened with a $21,000 debt," Grace retorted. "Why does his comfort always come at my expense?" Her father tried to intervene. "Grace, please, this isn't helping anyone. Let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Grace laughed bitterly. "You want me to be reasonable when you weren't? You had no right to touch my money without asking. This is your mess, and you need to fix it." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. For the first time, Grace saw something like shame flicker across her father's face. But her mother remained defiant, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll sell the boat," Robert finally said, breaking the silence. Taylor whipped her head around to face him. "Robert, no! That's our boat. We've had it for years. And we can't afford to keep it," he replied, his voice tired but resolute. "We'll sell it and use the money to pay Grace back." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "You're serious?" Robert nodded. "It's the least we can do." Taylor looked furious, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she turned to Grace with an accusatory glare. "I hope you're happy." "I'm not," Grace said quietly. "None of this makes me happy." "But at least you're finally taking responsibility." The drive home felt bittersweet. On one hand, she was relieved that her father was willing to take concrete steps to make things right. On the other, the entire situation had left a deep scar on her relationship with her parents. She couldn't shake the feeling that things would never go back to the way they were before. Over the next few weeks, Robert followed through on his promise. He listed the boat for sale, and though it took some time, he eventually found a buyer. True to his word, he transferred the full $21,000 to Grace's account. It was a huge relief to see her balance return to normal, but the emotional toll of the ordeal lingered. Her mother, however, remained distant. Their conversations were brief and strained, filled with unspoken resentment. Andrew, too, seemed awkward around her, though he occasionally sent her texts apologizing for his role in the situation. Grace appreciated the gesture, but couldn't help feeling that her family still didn't fully understand the gravity of what they had done. In the weeks that followed, Grace made a point of establishing clear financial boundaries. She added alerts to her credit card, changed her passwords, and even opened a new account at a different bank. She wasn't taking any chances. More importantly, she started saying no more often, something she had always struggled with when it came to her family. Looking back, Grace realized the ordeal had taught her an invaluable lesson. Trust was fragile, even within families, and it had to be earned. While she hoped to eventually rebuild her relationship with her parents, she knew it would take time and a lot of effort on their part. For now, she was content focusing on herself, her career, and the life she was building on her own terms. In the weeks following the repayment, Grace tried to move on with her life, but the events surrounding her parents' betrayal lingered in her mind like a stubborn shadow. The $21,000 had been returned to her account, but the emotional damage was far from repaired. Her relationship with her parents, particularly with her mother, had become distant and cold. She couldn't remember the last time they had spoken without tension seeping into their words. The once frequent family dinners and casual phone calls were now replaced by silence and avoidance. One Saturday morning, as Grace sat on her couch sipping coffee, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Andrew. "Andrew, hey Grace, can we talk? I feel like things have been off between us lately." Grace stared at the screen, conflicted. Part of her wanted to ignore him. She was tired of being the only one to fix things. But another part of her knew they needed to address what had happened. She took a deep breath and replied, "Grace, sure. Come by around 2. When Andrew arrived, he looked nervous, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. Grace gestured for him to sit on the couch. She waited, giving him the space to start the conversation. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Andrew began, his voice quiet. "I know I didn't handle things well. When you told me what Mom and Dad did, I didn't know how to react. I should have supported you more." Grace nodded, but she kept her expression neutral. "Why didn't you? You knew what they did was wrong." Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess." I didn't want to believe it. Mom and Dad have always been so, controlling. But this felt different, and I didn't know how to process it. I'm sorry if I made you feel like I didn't care." Grace's resolve softened slightly. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook entirely. "It's not just about how you reacted. It's about how you benefit from their behavior without questioning it. They've always put you first, Andrew, and I've always been expected to deal with it." Andrew looked down, shame written all over his face. "I know. I've been thinking about that a lot since we talked. I never asked for it, but I can't pretend I haven't taken advantage of it either. I want to do better, Grace. I want us to be okay." Grace studied him for a moment before finally nodding. "I appreciate that, Andrew. But it's not just about words. It's about actions. You need to hold them accountable too. If they keep getting away with this kind of behavior, they'll never change." Andrew promised he would, and, for the first time in weeks, Grace felt a small glimmer of hope that their relationship might recover. But as she watched him leave, she couldn't help but wonder if her parents would ever truly understand the gravity of what they had done. The following day, Grace received an unexpected call from her father. She hesitated before answering, bracing herself for whatever guilt trip or justification he might have prepared. "Hi, Grace," Robert said, his voice unusually subdued. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I wanted to apologize. You didn't deserve to be put in that position." Grace was caught off guard. Her father wasn't one to admit fault easily. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "I appreciate that. I know this doesn't fix everything," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm taking steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. Your mother and I have been going through our finances and cutting back on unnecessary expenses. We've also started seeing a financial counselor." This admission surprised Grace even more. "That's good," she said, unsure of what else to say. "It's a step in the right direction. I just hope you can forgive us," Robert said quietly. "I know it'll take time, but we want to make things right." Grace hesitated. Forgiveness was a complicated thing. She wanted to move forward, but the hurt they had caused wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. "I'm not there yet," she admitted. "But I appreciate that you're trying." Over the next few weeks, her father's words proved true. Robert made an effort to repair their relationship, checking in on her regularly and updating her on their progress with the financial counselor. Taylor, however, remained distant. She seemed to harbor resentment over the sale of the boat, often avoiding Grace altogether. When they did speak, her tone was clipped, and her words were laced with passive-aggressive comments. One evening, Grace decided she had had enough. She drove to her parents' house, determined to address the tension with her mother. When she arrived, Taylor was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She barely looked up when Grace walked in. "Hi, Mom," Grace said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Grace," Taylor replied curtly, "what brings you here?" "We need to talk," Grace said, leaning against the counter. "About everything that's happened." Taylor sighed, setting down the knife she was using to chop vegetables. "What more is there to say? You got your money back, isn't that enough?" "No, it's not," Grace said firmly, "because it's not just about the money. It's about the way you've treated me and the way you've refused to take responsibility for what you did." Taylor crossed her arms, her expression defensive. "I've done nothing but sacrifice for this family, Grace. I raised you, gave you everything you needed, and this is the thanks I get?" "Sacrifice?" Grace's voice rose. "You call using my credit card without permission a sacrifice? You put me in debt so Andrew could have a luxury vacation. That's not love or sacrifice, that's selfishness." Taylor's face turned red, and for a moment Grace thought she might finally admit she was wrong. But instead, her mother shook her head. "I did what I thought was best for the family." "No," Grace said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You did what was easiest for you, and until you can admit that, things between us won't change." With that, Grace turned and left, her heart heavy but her resolve strong. She couldn't force her mother to change, but she could control how much of herself she was willing to give to a relationship that felt one-sided. In the weeks that followed, Grace focused on rebuilding her life and setting boundaries. She limited contact with her mother, though she remained open to reconciliation if Taylor ever decided to take accountability. Her relationship with her father and Andrew, however, began to improve. They made a conscious effort to respect her boundaries and involve her in family decisions. Though the betrayal had left scars, Grace realized it had also taught her valuable lessons about self-worth and the importance of standing up for herself. She no longer felt obligated to shoulder the weight of her family's problems, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The journey to healing was far from over, but Grace knew she was on the right path. One step at a time, she was reclaiming her life and her peace. In the months following the confrontation with her mother, Grace had settled into a new rhythm of life. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the sting of betrayal resurfaced, but she was determined to focus on the things she could control. Her career was thriving, her friendships were stronger than ever, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was prioritizing herself over the endless demands of her family. Yet, the rift with her mother lingered like a wound that hadn't quite healed. Every now and then, Grace would catch herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures of family vacations, holidays, and celebrations where her mother's smile seemed so genuine. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the woman who had unapologetically dismissed her feelings and refused to take accountability. And one evening, as Grace sat on her couch watching the flickering light of a movie she wasn't really paying attention to, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her father. "Robert, can we have dinner tomorrow? Just the three of us? You, me, and your mom? I think it's time we talk." Grace stared at the screen, her emotions tangled in a mix of hope, hesitation, and dread. Part of her wanted to refuse. What was the point of another round of arguments and deflections? But another part of her, the one that still longed for some semblance of a family connection, couldn't ignore the invitation. The next evening, she found herself driving to her parents' house. The familiar route felt different this time, heavier somehow, as though the weight of unresolved tensions hung in the air. When she arrived, Robert greeted her at the door, his expression a mixture of relief and nervousness. "Thanks for coming," he said, ushering her inside. The house smelled of roast chicken and freshly baked bread, a deliberate attempt, Grace thought, to recreate the comfort of family dinners from the past. Taylor was in the kitchen, her back to them as she finished setting the table. When she turned around and saw Grace, her expression was guarded but not hostile. "Hi, Grace," she said simply. "Hi," Grace replied, keeping her tone neutral. They sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes the conversation was stilted and awkward. Robert tried to keep things light, asking Grace about work and Andrew's progress in school, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Finally, as the plates were cleared and the dessert was served, Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Grace," he began, "your mom and I have been talking a lot these past few weeks. We've been working with the financial counselor, and it's opened our eyes to some things we didn't want to admit before." Taylor shifted uncomfortably in her seat but didn't interrupt. Robert continued, "We've realized how much we've relied on you over the years, and how unfair that's been. What happened with the credit card was wrong. There's no excuse for it, and we're sorry." Grace's throat tightened. It was the first time she had heard her father explicitly acknowledge the harm they had caused. She glanced at her mother, who was staring down at her hands. "Taylor?" Robert prompted gently. Taylor looked up, her eyes meeting Grace's for the first time that evening. There was a vulnerability there that Grace hadn't seen before. "I didn't want to admit I was wrong," Taylor said quietly. "I felt ashamed, and instead of dealing with that, I doubled down and made things worse. I'm sorry, Grace, truly." The sincerity in her mother's voice caught Grace off guard. She had prepared herself for defensiveness, for more justifications and excuses, but this was different. For the first time, it felt like her parents were genuinely trying to understand the impact of their actions. "Thank you for saying that," Grace said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "It means a lot to hear you both take responsibility. But this isn't just about the credit card. It's about years of feeling like I had to take care of everyone else while no one took care of me." Taylor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You're right. We've put so much on your shoulders, and it wasn't fair. I don't know if I can ever make up for that, but I want to try." The three of them talked late into the night, delving into topics they had avoided for years: family dynamics, favoritism, and the unspoken expectations that had driven a wedge between them. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension and discomfort, but it felt like progress. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt like her voice was being heard. In the weeks that followed, Grace noticed small but significant changes in her parents' behavior. Her mother began calling her regularly, not to ask for favors, but to check in and see how she was doing. Her father sent her updates from their financial counselor, showing her the steps they were taking to avoid falling into old habits. Even Andrew seemed to be making an effort, reaching out more often and asking for her advice on school and life. Grace, in turn, worked on setting healthier boundaries. She stopped feeling obligated to fix every problem her family faced and learned to say no without guilt. It wasn't easy, but it was freeing. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Grace found herself sitting on her porch with Megan, recounting the events of the past few months. Megan listened intently, her expression shifting between disbelief and admiration. "Wow," Megan said when Grace finished. "I can't believe they actually owned up to everything. That's huge." "It is," Grace agreed. "I didn't think it would ever happen, but I guess people can surprise you." "So, do you feel like things are back to normal?" Megan asked. Grace thought about it for a moment. "Not exactly, but maybe that's a good thing. I don't think I want things to go back to the way they were. This feels better, more honest." Megan smiled. "I'm proud of you, Grace. You stood your ground, and it paid off." As the two friends chatted and laughed, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The journey had been painful and messy, but it had also been transformative. She had learned to value herself, to demand respect, and to prioritize her own well-being. And while her family was far from perfect, they were trying, and that was enough for now. For the first time, Grace felt hopeful about the future. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever. Whatever challenges came her way, she was ready to face them on her own terms.